Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershift, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome in to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Did you know that Andrew Jackson and the power that he wielded while president began to redefine the power of the presidency and what federalism looked like in the United States of America?
Did you know that Andrew Jackson may be the only president to have the era over which they presided named after him?
And did you know that Andrew Jackson was truly the first president to bring a cult of personality into the White House? Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 126, King Andrew the First? All right, everyone, welcome into episode 126. I am excited. Back-to-back extra credit episodes. The last episode was with my fellow history nerd, Zach Woods, and this one is with Mr. Bill Gorman. Bill, welcome back to the pod.
It is great to be back, and there's only one direction to go, and that's up, right?
Yes, absolutely. Well, we just spent a half hour trying to figure out the audio issues with your microphone. So, yes, we're just moving forward now. And if
we'll see
if Bill's audio, if Bill's audio isn't quite as high quality as as you have grown accustomed to it, it's because we're running into some issues.
Hopefully, you'll find, listener, that the sultry baritone that you've come to know from me still comes through loud and clear.
Yep. Yeah, well, like everyone said, you have a great face for podcasting. So. Before we dive into talking all things Andrew Jackson and his impact on the United States of America and our government, just two quick shout-outs. Our newest honor roll patron, Larry Duggar, thank you so much for signing up. And our newest patron at the history nerd level, which means a ton to me and is an enormous help to continuing this pod each and every week, Rita Huckle. Thank you very much. And I actually wanted to read, Bill, I got a Facebook message this morning, and right before we started recording this, from a guy named Brady. And Brady, I cannot even begin to try and pronounce your last name. I even got someone smarter than me, Bill, to try and pronounce it too, and we have no idea, so we're just going to stick with Brady. But Brady reached out and said, hey, just wanted to thank you so much for your podcast. I'm a U.S. history teacher, and ever since I started listening to your pod, I have felt so much more confident about teaching the content. You're amazing. Thank you so much. That was an awesome piece of feedback to get because I'm not sure, and we're 126 episodes into this podcast, and I always say that there were like three primary groups of people that I was doing the podcast for. It's like students going through U.S. history class, people who just wanted to learn the history of the U.S. again, or U.S. history teachers. And the U.S. history teachers, like this guy Brady, they were the number one reason. That was like the inspiration for me starting the podcast. So, Bill, I don't know if you know, but right before I left teaching, about 2 years before, I started an elective called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it was 180 45-minute class periods. I had no textbook to go from. I really didn't know much about Roman history. And I just signed up for it because it sounded fun and it's something I'd learn. And Mike Duncan's The History of Rome podcast, I don't know what I would have done without that podcast. I listened to that podcast, walking the dog, working out, commuting, everything. I was constantly listening to Mike Duncan and his History of Rome podcast. And I had so much more confidence in the classroom, and I was able to put together an actual full-year curriculum. Obviously, I used a ton of primary sources and everything else, and video and other types of media, but I was able to put together a full year's curriculum of Roman history just based on the outline, like the framework he gave in his podcast. And that is actually the reason why I started this podcast. So, I don't know. I thought that was pretty cool. I don't want to dominate this episode by talking about a Facebook message, but I just thought it was pretty cool because that is the reason, like, that's what inspired me to start the pod. So if you're a U.S. history teacher out there and you're listening to this and you're becoming more confident in the content and more certain with what you're teaching, that was the original purpose behind all of it. So
you're telling me that you just didn't push play on HBO's Rome and then just call it a day?
Now, I did show clips from HBO's Rome, and I had to use like video editing software. They may or may not have been illegally pirated off HBO Go, but because I had to cut out some pretty racy scenes from that show.
Chris, you gotta give the constant
disclaimer I had to give the constant disclaimer that, like, by the way, none of what's happening in the show actually happened. Like, none of this is real, but it is based on loose truths.
Dramatic license, my friend. Dramatic license.
Yeah, I mean, they were seniors. They got it. They were cool. They're cool. Okay, so let's dive into this episode today. Bill, you and I are going to talk about Andrew Jackson, the legacy that he left, its impact on our U.S. government, how Andrew Jackson's presidency sort of helped redefine the concept of federalism during this time. And I know that in the narrative, we are not through Jackson's presidency. We're pretty much just through his first presidential term. But his first presidential term is where most of the action is. So we're going to take a pause now that we have just recently covered the nullification crisis, the bank war, and Indian removal as recently as last week. Now Bill and I are going to sort of press pause and review, just take a step back and look at a broader view of like what's happening with the office of the presidency right now and how is it going to impact the United States moving forward. So Bill, I know you wanted to start off with your impression since you haven't been on the pod in a while and you wanted to get your 2 cents in on what's going on with Jackson and the presidency of the United States.
Absolutely, and it's important to me that my 2 cents is added, as I'm guessing you could tell.
So that's about how much it's worth. So yeah.
So well, in Andrew Jackson's time, that was a lot of money. So I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, we'll stick with that.
The umbrella idea that I think we'll start with is Andrew Jackson's legacy, as you said, but we're really talking expansion of presidential power. So first things first, I think it is fair to say that Andrew Jackson's legacy is complicated. It's probably not, we can debate it, but it's probably not super debatable. Historians and political scientists have consistently ranked Jackson as either a top 10 president or categorized him as great or near great for decades, right? His face, his image is on our currency. And that may not seem like a big deal, considering our sharp turn to credit and digital currencies of all kinds. But consider the others that have been selected for that honor. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. A nation's currency is symbolic.
Jefferson
on the ever-elusive $2 bill. Ulysses S. Grant. So you know the kind of rarefied company you're in when you appear on a nation's currency. A nation's currency is symbolic. Good, bad, or otherwise, it is symbolic. Who we select to appear on our money is a reflection of who we value. The period over which he presided, one marked by the spoils system, classism, and scandal, is known as the Jacksonian era. Washington was a part of the Revolutionary or Founding era. Lincoln was part of the Civil War era. Franklin Roosevelt was part of the Depression or World War II era. Jackson's era did not define him, rather he defined it. Again, this may seem small, but through the lens of American history, this is significant.
Yeah, and when you think about that, I mean, the only other we talked about this just for a second while you were spending time trying to get your microphone figured out, but the only other president that we could really think of that defined his own era, so to speak, was Jefferson. And that likely is more just because it was such a sharp contrast into how Washington and Adams ran the government. And, of course, Jefferson's era sparked 8 years of Madison and 8 years of Monroe. I mean, it ended up being a 24-year Virginia Democratic-Republican dynasty. But no one sort of just took it and totally redefined the nation seemingly like Jackson did. Yeah. One could make an argument.
Yeah. So I agree. I think the echoes through history obviously are lasting from Thomas and his political progeny. But
first name basis, huh?
Yes.
Interesting.
But I think what we're going to get into, Jackson may, and again, obviously this is debatable, but Jackson may have even stronger echoes to the present day than what Thomas Jefferson imparted upon us. So that, I think all of that was pretty high level, what I just went through. So next, I'd like to take you all through a slightly deeper dive into a few of the discrete areas of Jackson's legacy for further examination. And those core areas are as follows. First, the preservation of national government supremacy. Second, the rise of the everyman president. And if you could not see it, I did air quotes there around everyman.
I saw them. He did.
And third, the genesis of the imperial presidency. So let's start with the preservation of national government supremacy. For as long as we have had a democratic system underscored by federalism, and Chris will get into what federalism is and its consequences, its byproducts, etc. in a moment, we will always have an outstanding question about our governance. That is, what do we do when one level of government wants to tell another level of government to go take a hike? The subtext of that is, what happens when a state doesn't want to follow a federal policy? That question was prevalent at the Constitutional Convention. It was certainly not novel, but it wasn't explicitly addressed within our founding documents. Sure, you may be saying, but Bill, what about the supremacy clause of the Constitution? Surely that makes it abundantly clear. But of course, it is not that simple. And that leads us to the discussion of our first inflection point on the preservation of national government supremacy, the nullification crisis.
And Bill, before we jump into the nullification crisis, I do think it's worth it just to take a step back and talk and go over just for a couple minutes on what federalism is and why we're having this conversation, right? So I not only taught AP US history, but I also got to teach AP US government when I was teaching. And there were some parts of that class that I loved, and then other parts of that class that I really didn't love. But one of the things I always enjoyed discussing was the concept of federalism and how we see it played out throughout U.S. history and then how we see it play out today. And federalism, to boil it down quite simply, is a type of government in which power is divided between the national government and other units of government. So in this case, it would be the individual, 50 states. There's also a unitary government in which the central authority holds all the power, like the federal government would hold all the power. And then there's a confederation, and that's what we saw in the Articles of Confederation, in which the states, for example, were clearly dominant. And, Bill, you mentioned the Constitution and how it isn't really as explicit as we'd like it to be. And that's because the Constitution just addressed the relationship between the federal government and the states. But the American people have to answer to their state, and they have to answer to the federal government. Just like a person has to pay his federal income tax, but also has to pay state taxes and even city taxes, sometimes county taxes. Property taxes, right, are collected by the counties. So throughout the 20th century, the power of the federal government had expanded quite a bit. So throughout the 1900s, based on legislation, based on court decisions, based on 2 world wars, the power of the federal government really began to expand. And while the Constitution sets up this federal system, like you mentioned, it doesn't define what federalism is. And it doesn't define exactly when the national government should have supremacy or authority over state governments. And that's the type of gray area that led to things like the Nullification Act, the Nullification Crisis. Now, one thing, even through all of this, is because of that supremacy clause, which you mentioned, the Constitution clearly favors the federal government. Now, the issue is when we get into things like the necessary and proper clause and how that's been used, right? We know Hamilton used that in order to justify the creation of the bank, yet when Jackson went to war with the bank, he didn't think it was constitutional, right? And they're still going back and forth on whether or not the Supreme Court actually truly had the authority to determine that. And then you have the 10th Amendment, which reserves to the states or the people all the powers either not specifically delegated to the national government or specifically denied to the states. And the language in the general welfare and the elastic clauses and the 10th Amendment is vague enough to allow wildly different interpretations on who should have the power, the state, the local government, or the federal government. So the challenge is that in all of this, when people argue over it, they point to the same document to justify their argument, which just makes it even more confusing. And when you think about the type of federalism we have in the United States, you can view the lens of our federalist system through really one of 2 ways, and this is usually how they break it down when you teach a government class. And it's dual federalism or cooperative federalism. So dual federalism looks like a layer cake, right? Like you have the chocolate and the yellow cake, and with each layer of the government performing the task that makes the most sense for that level. And it's like clearly delineated where the authority lies and where it doesn't, where the authority and the power transfer or transition from one level of government to the next. And the initial framing and ratification of the Constitution seem to reflect this theory, because even people who supported a stronger national government proposed that the federal powers be distinct and limited, right? That's what the 10th Amendment was for. But over the course of time and the use of the necessary and proper clause and the general welfare clause, it became a bit more confusing. And you can see it's almost like the states felt like the federal government was dipping down into their layer and taking power from them. And what we see is that following the Civil War and then into really the 20th century, right, when you get into the New Deal, which was a response to the Great Depression, if you're not familiar with it, we'll get to it eventually, you can really see the federal government expand significantly. And this type of federalism, political theorists call cooperative federalism. And if dual federalism is that layer cake, right, where the different layers are clearly defined, cooperative federalism is going to be more like a marble cake, where the power between the federal government, the state, the localities, this overlapping they had overlapping jurisdictions, and this is called marble cake federalism. So it takes a very loose view on the elastic clause and allows power to flow through the federal government into the states and the local government. So like, drug enforcement involves federal agents. You have state troopers and you have local police. Like that would be an example of marble cake federalism. The federal government supplies funds for education, but the state and local school boards choose the curriculum and set qualifications for teachers. So that's like another example of the state, local, and federal government all being involved in one issue. And what Jackson brings, which I know you'll dive more into, is he brings like a serious reflection and debate over the role of the relationship between the federal and the state governments and what this federalism truly is in the United States of America. Because no president prior to Jackson had done what he is doing, and he's doing it with reckless abandon. And like you mentioned, the first example of that is the nullification crisis.
Chris, I just like to pause here and just take a moment to say, and you can quote me on this, that marble cake is superior to just a regular layer cake.
Okay, it was good to know.
It was important to me that you knew that.
That's good. That's good. I'll take your word for it. I think marble cake is good too.
We didn't even get into icings, but I prefer the marble cake.
Well, in Maryland, we have a layer cake, like 20 layer cake called Smith Island.
I've heard of this, and not to go on too much of a tangent, but they're very thin layers.
No, this is all
totally
cake, on
right?
topic. Yeah, it's really good. It's like 20 some layers. Yeah, made from these ladies on Smith Island, which no joke is an island of people in Maryland, and they have to take like a ferry to like civilization. They take a ferry back and forth to school and stuff because they're on an island, and yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, so back to federalism.
Good talk. Good talk on cake.
Yeah, good. It is. So you have this layer cake federalism and this marble cake federalism, And Bill, I know you wanted to dive into the nullification crisis and how this sort of created a conversation around all of this.
Yep. And as you talked about in some previous episodes, defining the nullification crisis, it came about because South Carolina didn't care for a particular set of taxes, specifically tariffs, that were in place, which were intended to protect American economic interests. I believe the South, and particularly South Carolina, would debate about whose interests they were actually protecting. But for Jackson's legacy, this inflection point is quite interesting, considering the popular conscience remembers Jackson as an ardent supporter of states' rights. But Abraham Lincoln, when faced with secession a couple decades later, cited to Jackson as a Unionist. Complicated legacy, right?
Yep.
For Jackson, in this particular instance, because I think you hit the nail on the head with your explanation of federalism, but its application to Jackson, I think we may be coining a term here. I don't know. The fact checkers will have to get me on this. I believe Jackson was a selective federalist. And so we'll get into that in a moment. But for Jackson, in this particular instance, what I mean by selective, his Unionist side won out. He declared, our federal union, it must be preserved. To extrapolate that out, we only need to flash forward to Lincoln, and we see echoes of Jackson's statements in Lincoln's House Divided and Union preservation rhetoric. Jackson's position, and I believe his position would set the tone for future presidencies, is that states have every right to disagree with a policy, to protest a policy, to question a policy. But that must stop ahead of nullification and secession. Jackson was willing to go to war over this line in the sand. His belief was that the Union is perpetual.
Now, and I really like that interpretation, and I will allow selective federalism to be coined by you today. In May of 2020. I'm sure no one else has ever said it or even thought about it. So I have to, if there's a Wikipedia page for it up there, I'll need to make sure I update it. But one thing I think is interesting is I do like this concept you have of selective federalism, but I think with Jackson it gets even more specific because it seems that if the federal authority came from the legislative branch or the executive branch, he was far more likely to lend it power and authority. Whereas if it came from the judicial branch and Marshall in the court, he viewed it in a very different way. He did not give the credibility and the power to the judicial branch that we do today.
No question. And I think part of the mythos of Jackson is that those two bodies of the federal government are answer to the people, right? That even
Yep.
though at that point in time, we still have the Electoral College. So,
Yeah.
so although
It's not going anywhere.
one of his, I think it was the election of 28. It was the first time we recorded a popular vote count, though, for the presidency. And so he could point toward, Jackson, that is, could point towards a look, the will of the people was done in this election, etc. And with the legislative body of the federal government, the Congress, specifically the House of Representatives, at that point in time, the Senate was still elected by state legislatures, if I remember my
You're
timeline
correct.
correctly. So I think his whole mythos was that he was a man of the people. If you remember, about 10 minutes ago, I used my air quotes for the everyman president. And so I think that's why Jackson granted enhanced legitimacy to those two branches of the federal government, whereas we'll see it in the bank war for sure when we get into the leader of the bank and then also Chief Justice Marshall. They're unelected. They didn't answer to the people at any point in time. And I think that fed into Jackson's id, so to speak, about who could claim the supremacy, the final say, and who could bind him as president. I completely agree with you, and I think it all is. I mean, who knows if we could ever unpack his psyche? I mean, there's reading about the man. He was complicated, to say the least. But I think that mythos around him is accurate, and I think you hit the nail on the head. And I believe it's because they are the people's representatives, because the people directly impacted their power or their ability to exert power.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I do want to point out for those listening, when Bill mentioned that at this time the Senate was still being elected by state legislatures, that is correct. If you didn't know, well, if you don't know now, you know. The 17th Amendment, which was passed in, I believe it was passed in 1912 and ratified in 1913. You may want to fact check me there, Bill. Just prior to World War I. And what that did is that allowed the people of each state to vote for their senator. Up to that point in the 1912, 1913, the state legislators elected each senator, and because of that, it was sort of nicknamed like the Millionaire Club. It's so much easier to bribe and corrupt just a handful of state legislators as it is to bribe and corrupt, half of an entire state's population. So they moved it just like the people vote for their representatives. The people now vote for their senators, and that was done in, I believe it was ratified in 1913. That's the 17th Amendment. But your point taken nonetheless, in that the president was elected at least indirectly by the people. All the representatives were elected directly by the people, and then the senators were still elected, like the president, indirectly by the people. Whereas the justices on the Supreme Court had no popular will put them there, outside of, I voted for this guy for president and this guy for senator, and the president will pick him and the senator will approve him. I mean, technically that is indirect representation, but I think if a couple branches further out from the trunk.
You have been fact checked, and you were correct. 1913, 17th
Awesome.
Amendment was ratified.
Great.
Under President Woodrow Wilson.
Very good. All right. Good. Well, I'm glad I just threw that out there and I wasn't totally wrong.
No, it's like you know what you're talking about.
Every now and then. Every now and then. When I don't, we just keep moving.
So can we talk about the flip side of Jackson's?
Yes.
Okay. So
100%.
On the flip side,
dive into it.
Of Jackson's thoughts regarding the national government's supremacy, we have the Indian Removal Act, which you and Zach recently dove into.
Yeah, just last episode. Mm-hmm.
It is not a great situation. I think that's fair to say. For as much as Jackson was interested in the preservation of the Union when it came to the nullification crisis, and its implicit and explicit statement on the power dynamic between the state and national governments, Jackson, his administration, and his interests, both actively and passively, looked the other way when it came to the national government's role during Indian removal. Part of the chief executive's responsibilities are to faithfully discharge the Constitution and the laws of the United States. During the Indian removal saga, Jackson elected to turn a blind eye to the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States. Jackson decided to again willfully and wantonly disregard the opinion of Chief Justice John Marshall, who ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the state could not regulate the intercourse of the Cherokee Nation and citizens of the state because that intercourse was to be carried on exclusively by the government of the Union. Not only does Jackson disregard the ruling of the Supreme Court, he also tacitly acknowledges a state's right to supersede the will of an enacted treaty executed by the government of the United States. What kind of unionist is that?
Sounds like a what was the phrase?
Selective unionist. I'm editorializing a little bit here, but the dirty legacy of Indian removal, an already not great aspect of the history of the United States, is that the motivations for it still exist today. Land, market expansion, moneyed interests. And so all of that is wrapped up in a legacy that Jackson left, which again, I keep coming back to that word selective. He was just being selective about it.
Yeah, it really was an era, so when we talk about what type of federalism are we looking at here? It's during this period, especially this 4-year period, and then, of course, eventually 8-year period when he wins re-election, it's you're sort of looking at the type of federalism that Andrew Jackson agreed with. And that's pretty much how he made his decisions. It's just sort of what he thought should happen. So when we think about another president who has some similarities to Jackson in his influence and even his political ideology, Thomas Jefferson to a certain extent, when the negotiation for Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase, is finalized, and Jefferson gets word that his representative at Monroe specifically has purchased Louisiana. He couldn't sleep at night because he was so worried about the power of the presidency, that he was taking on too much power because he knew they should do it. He knew it was an absolute no-brainer, but he also knew it was a really bad look and would set a bad precedent. Most presidents in our history are very concerned about the long-term impact of their actions and the precedents that they set. The interesting thing I've found from studying Jackson is I'm not saying he was wholly unconcerned about that, but he seemed to be far less concerned about what type of precedent he was setting than just doing what he thought should be done in the moment. He wasn't really as as they say in legalese, you'll understand this, Bill, since you pretend to be a lawyer, stare decisis, or let the decision stand. That's a big deal in law, looking at past decisions and past precedent. And normally, we expect our government officials to look at past decisions, to look at past precedent, and maintain at least a modicum of consistency with that. And that's why a guy like Jackson is so controversial in his time, because he really didn't do that. We will never editorialize on any current or very recent presidents in this podcast because their legacy have yet to be written. I think it usually takes anywhere from 20 to 50 years to truly understand the impact of a president. But President Trump is very different, right? In that he also doesn't focus on those past precedents as much. They don't seem to be as high on the priority list, and that's why he elicits a lot of emotions, both positive and negative, depending on your perspective. And I think we see that when people try and compare Trump and Jackson, and I think it's just a comparison that's far too simple and doesn't really apply. But in that regard, they both seem to do what they want to do in the moment, that may be politically expedient without focusing as much on past political precedents, which, time will tell. It took a long time to determine how Jackson's presidency turned out, and it will take that long to determine how our current and very recent presidents' legacies will turn out. But I think that's one of the things that I noticed the more I studied Jackson.
So next, I'd like to turn to the second aspect of how we're going to examine Jackson's legacy, and that is the rise of the everyman president. And Chris, for this section, I'd really like to just kind of talk about the popular image of Jackson as we sit here today. And I say that because, in my opinion, I think the myth of Jackson is actually what echoes most significantly in modern politics today. And the conclusion I'm drawing is that might be, I know it's number 2 on my list here today, but it might be number 1 in terms of his lasting and enduring effect on the office of the presidency, right? So, first off, Jackson had a nickname, right? I mean, Old Hickory. We would then go on for future cycles, starting with William Henry Harrison, I believe. He was Tippecanoe. I mean, just that was
in 1840. Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
I mean, you didn't have presidents going by nicknames before Andrew Jackson, right? That's again maybe slight, but somewhat significant. The other truly significant portion of this calculus is that Jackson came from ostensibly nothing. He was actually an everyman. Whereas we had presidents from those varied moneyed interests that we were just talking about, and George Washington, right? I mean, he was a war hero. So there are significant reasons why he rose.
Also very rich.
Well,
but yes.
Well, that was Martha's money. That was Martha's money. Let's get that straight.
Yeah.
So
he's a smart man.
So so it's this idea that is built and baked into 21st century Americana of the rugged individual pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Now, someone else can debate whether or not those are should be pieces of Americana, but I think you can point back, certainly for the presidency, back to Andrew Jackson for that concept's rise. I mean, every presidential cycle, every election, someone at some point says, you know what? I don't know much about him, but I'd have a beer with that guy or that gal, right? And that's how we're measuring people. And Andrew Jackson was that kind of guy. In 21st century television, on a show that I revere and have brought up multiple times on this podcast already, The West Wing. There's an entire storyline that goes through, that's a through line to the entire series, the big block of cheese day, where it's not even urban legend. This actually happened. There was a huge block of cheese in the White House lobby that Jackson would just say, hey, you want to come in and get some cheese? We'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. I mean, that's nuts. You can't think about that today, but it added to his aura of being an everyman. And finally, from me anyway, for how I view the rise of the everyman president, specifically through the lens of Jackson, is his inextricable link to the idea of populism within American politics. And I'm going to expand upon that in the third section of our look at Jackson's legacy. But I believe that Jackson tapped into something that until this point was not really a facet of American politics, and that is the concept of populism.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And when you think about Jackson, and I love how you mentioned that if the mythos of Jackson, like the legacy of Andrew Jackson that we all remember, and of course one of the purposes of this podcast is to throw the legacy and the mythos aside and dive into what actually happened and allow the the listener to determine for himself or herself what they think. And of course, I always encourage finding sources other than me, if you're able to. But a couple things I think about with Jackson. You mentioned it, how he really began the idea of the war hero president, the nickname. He was the everyman. Certainly, the campaigns of 1824 and 1828 took campaigning and politicking to another level. And you mentioned him being the everyman president. He really is. If you look back through his, and we haven't gone through his whole life's biography, but if you look back through his biography, he really did come from nothing. And he really worked his butt off to achieve everything he had achieved in his life, including the presidency, right, which took him one election more than it should have to get. And he instills within the people this idea that they can do it too. You know, he was born an orphan in the middle of nowhere, and he rose to be the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, a successful lawyer, a successful plantation owner. Obviously, something that we don't like applaud and cheer today, being a plantation owner and owning slaves. But back then, they viewed that as like a really good businessman, especially in the South. And then he rises to the presidency, right? He was governor of Florida for a brief period of time. He was a senator. So he really achieved everything you could achieve. The thing that's so interesting to me is that, and you'll sort of talk about it, is when he gets into the office itself, the criticism was that he operated almost like a king. Like, it was an imperial presidency, which you wouldn't think the common everyman would be. You'd think they'd be much more deferential. And but you'll dive more into that in just a couple moments. A couple other things. So you mentioned that he started this idea of the nicknames, which, yeah, that's great. That's very true. We also see him begin this trend of like a war hero becoming president. So you have, like, I'm just sort of doing this off the top of my head, so I may be missing someone, but you have William Henry Harrison in 1840 become president. Zachary Taylor becomes president after the Mexican-American War, 1848. Then following the Civil War, you have Grant in 1868. And then I don't think there's another.
Next.
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't think there's another one until my favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1900. And he, tried to run for a third term, actually, which we'll talk about, and wasn't able to succeed. And then following World War II, you have Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952, who was an incredibly popular president. And we've gotten away from it a bit in our most recent presidents, non-military. So, Bill, I know you wanted to dive into another perspective of the Jackson presidency, not the common man president, but hey, some of his critics viewed him as like an imperial president.
As our episode title alluded to, King Andrew the First, ? The third and final section of our examination of Andrew Jackson's legacy, for our purposes, is the rise of the imperial presidency. Beyond the urban legend mystique that Jackson imparted on the office of the presidency, it is my belief that the next most prominent aspect of Jackson's legacy resides in him being the impetus of the imperial presidency. Odds are that if you've watched the news, listened to talk radio or podcasts, or have been a casual student of history, and I hope if you're in episode 126 of this podcast, you would consider yourself more than just a casual student of history.
I would think so. Yeah.
You will have heard this term in some capacity. Odds are that it has come within the context of the particular political winds that are presently blowing, but nonetheless, #both sides have lamented and propagated the imperial presidency. We are going to look at Jackson's role in the creation.
And just real quick, there are a few things I enjoy more than the verbal hashtags. So thank you.
You are welcome. You are welcome. We are going to look at Jackson's role in that rise through the lens of the Bank War, which Chris got into a couple episodes ago at this point, I believe. The Bank War is an excellent example to highlight this dynamic and to comment on the legacy Jackson left his predecessors, which, as Chris alluded to, he may not have cared about that at all. And that legacy is rooted in Jackson's belief that executive authority is separate and apart from judicial constraint or legislative intent. You may be thinking to yourself, but if the authority to act is separate and therefore not constrained by either the legislative or judicial branches of the federal government, then who or what exactly does represent the check and balance on the president? If you would have asked Jackson, he might have just shot you for questioning his authority. When actually pressed on this principle during the reauthorization bill of the Bank of the United States, Jackson literally just ignored the Supreme Court and vetoed an act of Congress. Then Jackson took, at the time, unprecedented steps.
Well, the only thing I would I'm not a huge fan of picking nits, but the only thing I would nitpick here is that he didn't totally ignore the Supreme Court. He accepted that they made the decision. He understood where they were coming from, and he just thought they were wrong.
He
acknowledged it.
There is a
he acknowledged it.
There's a fair distinction, albeit slight in my mind, but I guess yes, if you can consciously acknowledge it, but then just say I don't care, I guess that's separate from ignoring.
Maybe that is ignoring. I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to throw that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So Jackson at the time took unprecedented steps to undermine and delegitimize the bank itself. He was ultimately censured for this abuse of power. But the crazy part is that his war on the Bank of the United States made him incredibly popular with the people, as the American people writ large had a deep distrust of bankers and the wealthy generally. And I mentioned this in episode 124. It's hard. Like, I get where Clay and Webster were coming from, but it's hard to get people really excited about like defending a wealthy banker. Yeah.
That's not really a good political situation to be in. Like, oh, who are we defending? Oh, we're defending the super rich guys who are making interest off of the loans from the United States of America and who are totally plugged in and connected to all the businesses and the goings on. Oh, and who's the other guy defending? Just the average person who's working really hard and trying to do their best to get by. Oh, wait, can I go argue for the other guy?
So I think it's a fair conclusion to draw that without Jackson being tapped into the pulse of the American people, the rise of the imperial presidency would have waned immediately to the will of the Congress or the wealthy. But because Jackson had popular support on his side, he was able to exert outsized, some might say unconstitutional, levels of power. And that is a significant legacy to leave your predecessors as the chief executive officer of the country.
Yeah. Really, Jackson's presidency up to this point in American history was, and you could probably argue with Washington, and even if we extrapolate forward, you may be able to make an argument with one or two more presidents. And we see it a little bit today with President Trump, but it truly was, with Jackson, it was a cult of personality. Like, they followed him. And the thing that makes him so unique, and one of the reasons why I say I don't really love the Jackson-Trump comparisons, and I could go on for days about what's wrong with all of them, but the one that's like most striking to me, Jackson was overwhelmingly popular. Like, insanely popular. He went in and ran against a son of a president in John Quincy Adams, who was the current sitting president, who had one of the best political resumes America had ever seen. And Andrew Jackson went in and walloped him in the popular vote, but lost because of the corrupt bargain. And then 4 years later, he did it again and beat him even worse it just absolutely crushed him. And then he has to deal with the nullification crisis, the bank war, Indian removal, all three very controversial situations, while albeit he still remained popular. And then he just won in a landslide again in his re-election. I mean, he was really, really popular for some of the reasons we have talked about in previous episodes and some of the reasons we've talked about in this episode today. He truly took on a cult of personality like no one had ever seen, and I'm sure you could argue have never seen since in American history. And because his cult of personality was so incredibly powerful and people were so emotionally loyal to him and everything he stood for, he was able to gain a lot more leverage to do what he wanted, because he knew the political consequences likely would not be there for him. So he could just do whatever he thought was best. He didn't have to do whatever was politically prudent, which is great in that it allows a president a certain amount of freedom to do what he thinks he's best, and hopefully one day she thinks is best. But at the same time, having that pressure on a politician is healthy too, because it keeps them from flaunting past precedents and past rules and, actually caring about all of the things that have made America great up to this point, if you want it to continue in its trajectory.
Thank you for tying a bow on and a link between my previous comments on the rise of populism and then tying it to its impact and role in the rise of the imperial presidency, Chris, because I think that hits the nail right on the head. It's, when you've got that level of public support and you act the way that Andrew Jackson acted, you are just unconstrained. You have been unleashed on the mechanisms of government. And when you have that kind of support from the will of the people, I mean, that's what starts the rise of the imperial presidency.
And I mentioned it, I think in either episode 123 or 124, I mentioned it in that, and gosh, I'm blanking on it now. I can't remember from when I was doing the research who said it, but it may have been Webster. Listeners can go back and fact check me on my own podcast. It's a little embarrassing, but someone basically said, like, if it wasn't for how insanely popular he was, we could actually put up a fight against him. But I mean, because he has the people behind him, no one gets in his way, because they know if they do, the people will crush them. And you see that throughout history. You see presidents that have such a mandate from the people and are so incredibly popular that they're able to be more bold in their actions. And we won't run through all the different presidents in which that's happened, because there are probably about a dozen who had a really clear mandate and were incredibly popular as they came into office. And they were able to do things that could have cost them politically if they weren't so.
No question. Popular. And I know we're wrapping this up, but just to add one other piece, I mean, we're talking about a guy who shot somebody. I mean, Andrew Jackson,
multiple times.
I mean, straight up, shot people, killed them, and that made him more popular. Like, I mean, that added to his mythos. I mean, that's the kind of cult of personality we're talking about here. I mean, draw your own extrapolations from current comments that have been made about shooting people, but that is, I mean, it's literal. Like, you literally had a guy, granted not as president before he was president, which I don't know if it makes it better or worse. Shot people in duels. So I mean, that is I don't know if you can sum up Jackson's legacy any better than that.
Yeah, and I mean, we can have a whole podcast on the qualities, the personal characteristics that made Jackson great. And then, probably an even longer podcast on the personal characteristics that made Jackson just like not someone you'd want to model yourself after. And that's always the thing that fascinated me about Jackson. Like, there's so many things I love about him. Like, I love his don't give a crap attitude. Like, I love that to a certain extent, right? Like, I love how fearless he was throughout his life. personally and politically. I mean, the guy fought in duels. He did not back down. He was not controlled by like small thinking or other people's criticisms. Like, he did what he thought was best in the moment. And there's a lot I admire about that, because I think most of us do not have the courage to do that, whether we end up being right or wrong. But then, I mean, he was incredibly short-tempered. Almost all of his friends at one point stopped being his friends throughout his life because they just can't deal with him and can't handle him. He had political allies that ended up hating him. He had a lot of people that he was very close with that never wanted to talk to him again. And there's one common thread in all those relationships, and it was Andrew Jackson. So we could go on and on about Jackson. Bill, thank you so much for coming on the pod and discussing him in more detail before I hop into episode 127 next week and continue with our narrative of his presidency. Is there anything else you want to add? Any final word? Before, as we would say on a teacher's history of the United States, before the bell rings here, Bill?
I started off by saying that Jackson's legacy is complicated. I think it is more appropriate after my examination of Jackson's legacy to say that that legacy is a contradiction. And in the words of a Jackson biographer, this biographer wrote, Jackson was dictator or Democrat, ignoramus or genius, Satan or saint. And I think the answer to all of those is yes. And so that's how I'll leave it with my examination of King Andrew the First ? And that summation came from historian and biographer James Parton in his work, The Life of Andrew Jackson.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Bill. I think that is the perfect way to leave it, and that's where we will leave it. Next week, episode 127, we are going to continue with our narrative of the U.S., and we're going to look at the re-election campaign of Andrew Jackson and the beginning of his second term, which, albeit admittedly, is not quite as exciting as his first. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.